Oh boy.
Alright. After seeing the condition of that carburetor and knowing that there's nothing but water in the tank, I think we're just going to call it quits. Push it off here. Well, here it is. All back together. Welded the cracked stuff under the seat. Fixed the levers and stuff in there. All the stuff over there. All the wiring. The carburetor. And took the deck apart, cleaned it, greased it, fixed it. So. Here she is. What a turd. So here's the 2130 ready to go to a new home. This ended up being a real basket case, but we got her back together. And before it gets sold, I wanted to show you guys what all we did. So the first thing that we had issues with was the fuel system. So the fuel pump here was replaced, but there was an issue with it still not pumping fuel. So I replaced the mechanical arm. The arm is removable on this. I replaced it with an OEM arm, and that gave it the sufficient amount of travel it needed to pump fuel. We still got some cracked blower housing areas here. I don't know what happened there. And there's a little bit over here too. And then after we got it pumping fuel, and this was still all cranking with the little jumper wire. We'll get to the cranking starting system here in a minute. And I ordered a choke kit for this to get the choke linkage hooked back up. So now the choke works. Actually moves that arm like it should. So then we pulled the carburetor off, rebuilt the carburetor. They're pretty easy carburetors to rebuild. They're not terribly difficult. Put it in the ultrasonic tank and cleaned it. And then we worked on the starting system. So this one had a new starter. It still does. The starter was not receiving a signal. The solenoid was not coming down to the starter. And they had done a bunch of stuff up in here. They bypassed the PTO switch here. They added in an extra PTO switch to actually still control the PTO. But even though they bypassed that, we were still not getting juice down to the starter solenoid. So I crawled underneath and got to the wiring for the let's see if I can show where this is. Basically right, it's kind of in a bad spot unless you have the panels off, and even when you have the panels off, it's not really easy to get to. But the brake switch wiring goes in behind the cowl area here. It's basically like back in here, and it's all walled off. You can't really get to it. You can't get it to it from the back side because of this screen. You can't get to it from the front. Even with the panel off of there, you can't really get to it. But I found that the brake switch was basically not working at all. As soon as I clicked the brake switch, the brake switch was not being engaged, I should say. The switch itself was functional, but it was not being engaged by the pedal. So we got the brake switch fixed, and now the thing cranks as it should from the key switch. I cleaned up all the connections up here, new battery terminal ends. Everything's good to go. It charges great. It runs well. I cleaned up all of the crap that was down in here. We fixed an oil leak at the front cover, the very lower end down there. There's a leak there. There was an oil leak up here on the valve cover. These are all common issues, which is why I'm pointing it out. It's just stuff to look for. And then, get in here. Yeah, that guy right there was leaking. Very common, not just this machine, but all the machines that use these. So that's the oil drain. Fix the oil drain there, and then After it was running well, I pulled the deck and fixed the pulley here. These double pulleys have bearings, roller bearings inside, and what happens is the pulleys themselves will not hold the bearings tight, and so they'll start wobbling around. So I took that pulley off on the bench, and I went over with the punch and peened in all of the bearing OD surfaces so that it was a nice tight fit. On the top and the bottom, there's a bearing at the top and a bearing at the bottom of that pulley. This is very common to the 2000 series, so almost every single one I see has a sloppy bore in this pulley. So after I fixed that, put in a new grease fitting on the spindle here that was broken, greased everything, put a new belt on it, and it mows great. Also went in and took care of the loose axle pivot points here, replaced those. This is another common thing. These things just fall out, and then the axle wobbles back and forth, and now the axle's nice and tight. It's not going anywhere, and it's adjusted well. Then I pulled the fender pan off, and we accessed all of the crap that was underneath, which you can't see anymore. Basically, got inside here, and the main reason for pulling the fender pan off, well, actually there was two main reasons. The first main reason is to get to the auto gear system clutch assembly. There's a breather tube on the top of that clutch assembly in there, and there's actually a drain plug at the bottom of it, which is not covered in the manual. I don't think many people know about it. Probably not many people care about it, honestly, but at the bottom of that clutch assembly, you can replace that fluid independently of the rear end. So the rear end holds like 6-something quarts. It's a lot. It's a lot of fluid, but none of it gets up to the clutch assembly, which needs its own lubrication. The stuff that came out of there was like black. It was gross. So that has been serviced. The rear end has been serviced. The clutches work pretty well on this, actually. 6 gear, it'll pull right up a hill, no problem. Lubricated all of the pivot points for the deck and for the gear selector, because all of those were pretty seized up. This thing had a hard time even coming out of gear when we very first brought it home. Fixed some leaks in the tires, and then while the fender pan was off, the last thing that I did is I welded this pivot point here on this top pivot point here, or not pivot point, sorry, the bend in the plate here. The bend in this arm, the welds crack around that. So while this was off, I welded that. This had also cracked around the weld, so I welded here and I welded there. And that pretty much rounded up the surfaces. I greased everything while I was in there, cleaned up all the pivot points. The control mechanism for the auto gear system is similar. When you look at the pedal linkage here, the rod that this is connected to on the other side of the tractor has a spring connected to it, and it kind of rides back and forth. It goes like, it's a rod with a spring around it, and the spring is supposed to keep tension on the rod, but they seize up over time. So I took care of that, and now this thing is ready to go. I even went so far as to give it a bath. So I'm going to put that air cleaner back on, and then we'll fire it up and I'll show you how it runs. Alright, so here she is. Give her some chokes. You're about half throttle. Listen to it. Listen to it. Doesn't burn any oil. Sounds great. Got it in neutral right now, so forward pedal is completely engaged. What you're hearing that whine is the gear system or the clutch system and the transmission. She's good to go. A little cold. It's about 35 degrees out right now. I'll let her warm up a little bit. That was a little mean. another 10 years. I know not a lot of people are into these machines, but I gotta say they're not as bad as you hear. So they're worth saving. Save them. Don't scrap them. All right, guys. Thanks for watching. We'll be back.